So many of the presentations you guys have heard over the last several days involving decommissioning have been, technical, involving survey protocols, new drone methodologies, statistics. So now we're going to switch a little bit and talk about the real life in decommissioning. That's after all the science has been done, and how politics rears its ugly head in decommissioning. In some cases, specifically in California, and I guess let me see a show of hands. Who has been involved in decommissioning activities in California? Okay, quite a few. That's good. So hopefully my discussion here has not been, applicable to your work, but maybe some of it has. Who knows? We'll see. So I'm Phil Rutherford. I was senior manager of radiation safety for the Santa Susana Field Lab in Southern California. Also radiation safety officer for 25 years. I retired about 7 years ago. So let's switch. So the case study is at a facility that I worked at. The Santa Susana Field Lab is 3,000 acres in total, most of which is devoted to NASA-supported rocket engine testing. All that has been completed now. But Area 4, which was about 300 acres, was devoted to nuclear research for the AEC originally, and then later on the Department of Energy. And various different corporate organizations were involved. North American Aviation initially, then Rockwell International, then the Boeing Company. And as I say, work was done for the AEC and the DOE. More recently, in 2014, Northwind has taken over as the prime contractor for the remaining nuclear decommissioning. So other players that I'll be talking about are the California Department of Public Health, Radiologic Health Branch, who administer they're like the agreement state agency. Also the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC, whose main job is to manage hazardous waste and hazardous waste cleanup. But as we will see later, they've been more heavily involved in radiological decommissioning. Also the Environmental Protection Agency and various California and US legislators. So as we'll see, this has been a mixture of politics, activism, legislation, litigation, what I call regulatory abuse, and also regulatory inaction. So I'm sure you can't read much of this, but this is taken from the Department of Energy website. And it sort of gives the timeline of the various nuclear activities. We had about 10 nuclear reactors, small-scale experimental reactors, a lot of which were sodium-cooled. We also manufactured and tested SNAP reactors. Most of you are probably familiar with the SNAP programs of earlier years involving plutonium-238, but we also made reactors that actually powered satellites. In fact, one of those was launched in Vandenberg Air Force Base in the 60s. It's still orbiting. It actually operated for a couple of months until something caused a shutdown. I'm not sure what, but anyway, it's still orbiting up there. We also manufactured nuclear fuel, plutonium fuel, uranium carbide. We had a hot lab that was used for sort of decladding spent irradiated fuel from the rest of the DOE complex in the US. And also is the Center of Excellence for liquid sodium coolant experiments. testing pumps, heat exchangers, valves, etc., for sodium-cooled reactors. So this is what Area 4 looked like in the mid 1980s. As I say, about 300 acres in size. There was approximately 270 buildings there, half of which were owned by the Department of Energy, half of which were owned by the Boeing Company, or originally North American Aviation. If I refer to Boeing, I always refer to the previous kind of legacy companies. So the status in 2014, 18 years ago, in terms of decommissioning was pretty good. We actually had 27 nuclear and radiological facilities, as I mentioned, fuel fabrication, reactors, critical assemblies, etc. So the Boeing-owned facilities were either licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Radiological Health Branch from California. So we had gone through decommissioning for most of these facilities. Decommissioning was completed. Surveys were done by Boeing or its predecessors, by ORISE on behalf of the Department of Energy, or A&L on behalf of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and also the Radiologic Health Branch, all doing verification and validation surveys. Also, the US EPA, that's pretty unusual, of course, in the standard way of doing things, but the various community activities and stakeholder activities it's basically demanded the US EPA come in after the fact and review all the previous survey documentation and the data, and also do a fourth verification survey themselves. And they confirmed all the other results. So as a result, in 2004, 25 of the 27 facilities had been released for unrestricted use and removed from the licenses, if appropriate, and 19 of those have been demolished. So everything was just hunky-dory in 2004, but a few years earlier than that, some of the litigation started. The first one was, well, you recall in 1997, the NRC came up with their 10 CFR 20 subpart E license determination rule, 25 milligram per year. And several years later, the California Department of Health conducted public hearings, as is normal with agreement states. They generally adopt by reference the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations. And so California attempted to do that in this case. However, it kind of raised the attention of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and also the Committee to Bridge the Gap, which is a California-based anti-activist association, anti-nuclear association. So in 2002, they sued the Department of Health Services and opposed the adoption of 10 CFR 20 subpart E. Several years later, the judge in the case ruled for the plaintiffs, and ordered the Department of Health Services to conduct a CEQA EIR. CEQA is the California equivalent of NEPA. It's the California Environmental Quality Act. And the EIR is, of course, an environmental impact report. And the objective was to select a safe dose-based standard for decommissioning. Now, 20 years later, the DHS has apparently no intention to comply with that judge's order. It became very apparent only a few years later, but now they still have not conducted an EIR. And so The NRCs at 25 milliampere cannot be imposed in California. Now, this is a little wordy. I don't expect you to read it all, but between the years 2001 and 2004, there were no less than 10 Senate bills introduced into the California Senate in Sacramento. And all of these basically attempted to usurp the decommissioning process. The authors of these bills were either State Senator Sheila Kuehl or State Senator Gloria Romero, but essentially they were used as proxies for the Committee to Bridge the Gap, whose president is Dan Hirsch. So the main objective of these bills, which is highlighted in red, was to require that all decommissioned material, namely building debris that had been surveyed, released for unrestricted use, met all federal and state cleanup standards, and nevertheless, all that decommissioned material should be disposed of low-level radioactive waste. This was actually vetoed, as we'll see in the next slide. The other objective was to indefinitely delay the establishment of a low-level radioactive waste disposal site in California named Ward Valley. Again, that was basically terminated in a similar way than Yucca Mountain. But the third main objective was to transfer authority for the regulation of radioactive materials from the Radiological Health Branch to the DTSC, who, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't even have any health physicists on staff at that time, and they were basically the regulator for hazardous waste. And then the fourth main objective was to impose on Santa Susana a zero-risk cleanup goal. So not 25 millirem per year, not 10 to the minus 4 risk, not 10 to the minus 6 risk, but zero. So I mentioned Senate Bill 1970. This was actually vetoed by then California Governor Gray Davis. But as a compromise, he issued Executive Order D-6202, which prohibited the disposal of decommissioned material to Class 3 and unclassified landfills, at the location of which material had been sent prior to that, and required essentially that decommissioned material to be disposed of either a Class 2 or, as is usual, a Class 1 hazardous waste disposal facility. Also, the executive order, which is known as the Governor's Moratorium, reminded the Department of Health Services its obligation to adopt dose-based cleanup standards. Okay, now skipping forward a few years to 2003, a lot of these things were going on in parallel, of course. The Department of Energy issued an environmental assessment. Now, in the early 90s, or actually the late 90s, 1990s, the Department of Energy and also the California Radiological Health Branch had approved for Santa Susana a 15 millirem per year dose for cleanup, principally soil. So soil cleanup levels were calculated based on 15 millirem. And this was obviously consistent with the NRC's 25 millirem, a little safer, if one believes that 15 is safer than 25. And also consistent with what at the time, in the mid-1990s, there was also the EPA recommended a dose for circular remediation sites, 15 millirem. And again, those of you who were involved in decommissioning in those years, you probably remember there was a conflict between EPA 15 and NRC 25. 15 was safe and 25 was unsafe. So we thought that, well, we'll adopt 15. We kind of satisfy everybody. So as I say, in 2003, the Department of Energy issued a formal environmental assessment. Several years later, in September 2004, the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Committee to Bridge the Gap, okay, these two same guys, sued the Department of Energy, arguing that a full environmental impact statement be prepared. And those of you who are familiar with those kind of terminologies, you know that an EIS is much more voluminous and requires a lot more analysis than an environmental assessment. So in 2007, the judge who was ruling that again ruled for the plaintiffs and ordered the Department of Energy to complete an EIS with the records of decision compliant with the NEPA. Now, the Department of Energy took 11.5 years to issue a final EIS. That's a long time. One of the activities that was done during that was a complete radiological characterization of all the land in Area 4. And indeed, Shannon Thompson, who is somewhere there you go, he was involved in supporting the EPA in that job. So far, records of decision have been issued for building demolition and also groundwater cleanup. However, for soil cleanup, which was the main focus of the EA, a record of decision has not yet been issued. Okay, let's jump back again to some legislative action. SB 990, Senate Bill 990, issued in 2007. This required that, that both radiological and chemical risk assessments done at Santa Susana utilize the most conservative land use, namely rural agricultural. So this meant that the risk assessment that one does had to assume that all the food eaten by the resident or the farmer was actually grown there. So not just fruits and vegetables, but whole produce, all beef, chicken, pigs, fish, all was eaten and from on site. Obviously, a very much more restrictive land use than what was used at the time, which was just conventional residential land use with backyard fruits and vegetables. And also more restrictive, of course, than what the actual future land use will be for this site, which is open space recreational land. SB 990 also gave officially regulatory authority over radiological remediation at Santa Susana to the Department of Toxic Substances Control. It took it away from the Radiological Health Branch. SB 990 became law in January 1, 2008. And at this stage, unfortunately, the Radiological Health Branch of the Department of Public Health effectively can bow out of both the technical and the political aspects of decommissioning at Santa Susana. So Boeing was not going to stand for this. We actually sued the Department of Toxic Substances Control and the state of California. And interestingly enough, the Department of Energy and also NASA, who oversaw the rocket engine test remediation, they did not join Boeing in this lawsuit. And we'll see why later on. We actually won the lawsuit in 2011. And this was in federal court. And the judge overseeing the case struck down this new law as being invalid and unconstitutional in its entirety, and enjoined DTSC from enforcing or implementing SB 990. The judge's order was upheld on appeal 3 years later. I've got a scam likely call here. Although now, 8 years later, and inexplicably, the California Health and Safety Code still includes verbiage from SB 990. And the DTSC website still claims that SB 990 is valid law and that remediation at SSFL is still subject. I have made inquiries of both the agency and the California legislators who introduced that bill, and also the California Attorney General. Why is this so? And no response, of course. It's always hard to answer impossible questions. How are we doing? Okay, with time. I'll jump forward a few years, 2010. Again, I mentioned that the Department of Energy and NASA did not join Boeing in the lawsuit, and the reason why is because they had negotiations with the DTSC and signed what was called the 2010 Agreement on Consent, which basically specified how radiological and chemical cleanup would be done. So some of the key aspects of that was that it forbade the use of any form of risk assessment. Throw the US EPA risk assessment guidance out of the window. We're not going to do risk assessment. It's eliminated the use of any risk-based or dose-based soil concentration cleanup standards. It required cleanup to background, or zero tolerance for any residual contamination in soil. Not just that. I mean, if you look in Marston, of course, there are ways one can do, background comparisons using Wilcox and Ransom. You compare the distributions, basically. This went even further, however. It required every single sample that was taken. And again, we'll be analyzing up to 60 radionuclides, maybe 200 chemicals. It required every single sample to meet a statistical kind of parametric-based, upper confidence level, basically. And if any one analyte in that sample exceeded the parametric background level, then it had to be considered low-level radioactive waste. Also, to make it even more kind of draconian, they define soil as not just soil, but also any debris, any structures, or any anthropogenic materials. So basically any building debris from buildings that have been remediated and are decommissioned and released for unrestricted use would need to meet these kind of criteria. And if it didn't meet that criteria, then everything had to be sent to either a licensed low-level radioactive waste site. And so basically this agreement in consent, which was a binding legal document, but not law, it actually implemented all the prior failed and challenged legislation in the past 10 years. Okay, so between the years 2010 and 2013, the Boeing Company, and again, I mentioned Boeing, DOE, and NASA, we were the three main RPs, responsible parties, obligated to do cleanup. So between these years, Boeing demolished approximately 40 remaining Boeing-owned non-radiological buildings in the other parts of Santa Susana involved in rocket engine testing, and also the remnants of one former released nuclear facility. The DTSC, who, as I mentioned earlier, who's now in charge of radiological remediation, they require that the radiation surveys be done for all these non-radiological buildings, not before demolition, and also all the debris after demolition. So Boeing did that, and all the data and reports were reviewed by not only DTSC, who who in the interim, I think, had hired 2 health physicists. But they also sent the reports to the Radiological Health Branch and the US EPA, who had many more health physicists, obviously. So that was good. All the reports and data were approved, and so this portion of the program was successful. However, in early 2013, Boeing submitted plans to demolish 5 remaining former nuclear facilities that had been decommissioned, surveyed, and released for unrestricted use, but was still standing. They had not been demolished yet. So again, here we come with another lawsuit in August 2013, Committee to Bridge the Gap. And does this name keep occurring here? And also others involving, I think, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, Southern California Federation of Sciences, a consumer watchdog, a whole bunch of activist organizations. They sued not only the DTSC and the Department of Public Health, and also Boeing, alleging that the demolition debris from these release facilities was low-level radioactive waste and should be disposed as such. A jump forward 5 years, the legislative process, the legal process is really slow in California. It's probably slow everywhere, but anyway, it's kind of not glacial in speed in California. 5 years later, this complaint was actually denied. So we won that case. However, of course, it was immediately appealed. And here we are 4 years later. It's still under appeal and hasn't been resolved. So those 5 buildings are still standing today. Okay, jump forward to 2020, only 2 years ago. And again, now we'll switch to the remaining Department of Energy buildings. Remember, some buildings were owned by Boeing, some were owned by the Department of Energy. At this point, Boeing had ceased to be the primary contractor for the Department of Energy, and Northwind had taken over. I had also retired several years earlier. And so here, the DTSC and DOE signed a 2020 AOC, like a binding agreement, whereby 2 of the former DOE radiological facilities, nuclear facilities that had been surveyed and released for unrestricted use, plus 4 buildings that had been used for liquid sodium research, which had no history of radiological use at all. They said the debris from these buildings should be both classified and managed and shipped and disposed of as low-level radioactive waste and sent to Energy Solutions in Utah. And indeed, in a public Zoom meeting, a DTSC official, management official, made a statement that buildings with a history of radiological use, regardless of the status of restricted release, and regardless of the status of surveys showing indistinguishable from background, it was enough to say that the waste could be, and indeed would be and was, characterized as low-level radioactive waste. At the DTSC, in all the documentation with this, used a favorite phrase, out of an abundance of caution. And when they were asked by me for any legal or regulatory citation for this criteria, again, we're met with silence. Again, hard questions they just ignore. So again, you saw this picture before, the 270 buildings in Area 4. In 2005, it looked like this. Most of the buildings were gone. There was maybe a couple of dozen left. The buildings that were that I've just been talking about, which were DOE owned, these were the subject of that AOC, and they were going to be demolished. So I I've talked about the phase in 2013 when we were taking down Boeing-owned buildings. And then in 2020, 21, we're taking down the Department of Energy buildings. And in the first one, there was a lawsuit, as I said, so lots of legal papers going backwards and forwards. And so these questions were specific questions that were answered in writing to the court by senior DTSC managers. So the first question is DTSC approval needed for conventional building demolition? And for the Boeing buildings, the answer was no, definite no. It jumped forward to when they were taking down Department of Energy buildings, that their actions were definitely yes. Does DTSC regulate radioactive waste? In 2013, no. And yet in 2020, yes. So you can see how their opinions about radiological remediation were just going 180 degrees. Does DTSC understand the concept of unrestricted release? In 2013, yes. But more recently, no. Is decommissioned material from released radiological buildings regulated as low-level radioactive waste? In 2013, the answer was a definite no. In 2020, the answer was yes. And then did DTSC request assistance from the Radiological Health Branch and US EPA to review radiation safety data? Remember, DTSC is not really expert in radiation or radioactivity. In the early building demolition, they definitely did. They got advice from these other organizations, but in 2020 for the DOE buildings, they did not. So can building structural surface contamination measurements be compared with background soil concentrations? 7 years ago, no. Now, yes. Does disposal of building debris as low-level radioactive waste cause irreparable harm? And again, irreparable is taken from the accusations and the allegations in the lawsuit. The answer, as previously, was no. Now it is yes. And finally, does Santa Susana pose an imminent threat to public safety? 7 years ago, the answer was no. Now it is yes. So then the Department of Energy had torn down all its buildings, and late last year, there was one building left called the Sodium Pump Test Facility. This was not a nuclear facility. It was a sodium test facility. It had no history of radiological use. Nevertheless, as required by DTSC, it was surveyed by Northwind, and all the measurements are declared to be indistinguishable from background. Nevertheless, DTSC and DOE stated that all the material go to energy solutions as low-level radioactive waste, irrespective of having characterization data showing no elevated radioactivity. So October 1st, 2021, ignoring the optics of this demolition, the Department of Energy actually blew up the building 4462. This is what it looked like. I mean, when it was operating, it had lots of walls and everything. So this is just the remaining shell of the building. And hopefully this will work. So this created a furor in the local media and with the community. The DOE had claimed, okay, we're going to have dust suppression protocols, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't know about that. Now, granted, I mean, to give the DOE, a bit of some compliments. I mean, there were many air monitors around the site, which are kind of continuously operating. They looked at all the data from the air monitors, and they didn't see any anthropogenic radionuclides in their results. So that was good, not surprisingly, because it's a non-radiological facility. However, of course, all the debris, once it came down, was still classified, managed, shipped, and disposed of as low-level radioactive waste. So we thought that was it. However, 2 months ago, now remember what Boeing's attitude to all this was. I mean, we sued the state over SB 990. We refused to sign up this cleanup to background, agreement. But nevertheless, a DTSC and Boeing signed a settlement agreement just a couple of months ago, following a 15-month secret mediation. Now, those of you who are involved in communicating with the public and the local communities, 15-month secret mediation, my goodness, what's that? Everything's supposed to be open and transparent. The public has to have input to everything. So the public hated that. However, the key decision in that settlement agreement was Boeing will clean up radionuclides in soil in its areas of responsibility to background. Now, when I read this, I thought, thank goodness I'm retired. Because if I'd still been working there, I would have been involved in that secret remediation or secret mediation, sorry. And I can imagine what I would have said about this. However, that's still an ongoing issue. So why has this happened? Originally I had a final slide here with a bunch of bullet points under this title, and I was going to attempt to identify the culprits, the individuals and the organizations. But then I was reviewing that a few days ago. I said, this isn't really something I'd want to present to you guys. It's not very diplomatic, not diplomatic at all. And then I also realized that really it's not the individuals or the organizations that are at fault and why this is happening. It's it's LNT, linear no threshold model. The model makes it possible for certain folks to say there's no safe level of radiation. And that's why all of this political stuff, legislation, litigation is aimed at going down to zero, because zero is the only acceptable thing to do for the public's point of view. Any slight increase in residual contamination, radiation that meets federal standards, nevertheless is unsafe radiation. And they don't want anything like that. So that has been why this has happened. It's not people, it's not organizations, it's the LNT. So I have online a like over 100-page paper with 600 online public citations, which documents all of this history. Feel free to kind of go look at it. It makes really good bedtime reading. And if you've got any questions later on after this, you can email me or call me. But now I think I'm out of time, 9 minutes over. So are there any questions? No questions online? Yes, sir. Mike. Hi.
Yeah, Mike Boyd. Hi, Phil. Great talk. And I'm still with EPA for another week and a half. So I wanted to thank you for telling a tale that doesn't paint EPA as the villain. So,
no, I avoided that.
Maybe we show up in your URL. Another plug I wanted to do is I know LNT presents problems, but I wanted, my view is that the problem we have is the implementation of optimization and the misinterpretation of ALARA as meaning not having a floor, which is wrong. And I want you to think about attending Dr. Terry Schneider's lecture at 4:15 in in the special AAP session, where he'll talk about some new activities on bringing reasonableness into the system of protection. I think you'd enjoy that. Change my hats. I'm on the board of directors, and I'm the director responsible for the decommissioning section. If you will, most of you, especially if you're a member of this section, stay put for a little bit. If you're not, stay put and consider joining us. Phil has done an amazing job reinvigorating or trying to reinvigorate this section. And we've got a business session now. And we really need your input and your ideas, because we really want to get this thing going again. And Phil's tried his best with emails. And I think collectively, if you're willing to stay a little bit, we might get this light a fire under this section. Thank you, Phil.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Yes, sir.
Just very briefly, I don't want to say a lot. I've spent from 1978 to 2016 intermittently working in the state of California doing decommissioning work. I worked there at the Santa Susana when Rocketdyne was there, supporting the liquid metal fast breeder program. And it's worse than Phil said. He's really been very kind, because there's very inconsistency. I had sites where they allowed us to base a cleanup on a dose and risk, while simultaneously at the same time at another site, if you had a RAD controlled area on your site, everything had to, all the debris, all soil had to be disposed of at the low-level radioactive waste site. And it's even worse than that. I'm being way too kind, because the state of California representative, and it was highly dependent on who your representative was. Some of them were very realistic and worked with you and without actually allow you to follow the real laws. And others, they would define a bright line of the mean of the background concentration of radionuclides, not realizing that half of all your samples are going to be above the average by definition, of course, and the other half would be below. And I've actually had, when this was way back, not by my age, it's most of your ages, where the California, the toxic,
the DTSC
site that obviously had no contamination based on the characterization samples. And you told me, Steve, write a cover letter for my signature that says this 600 acre plus site in Long Beach and Lakewood can be released, and I'll go out and talk to the members of the public, and I'll fight the battles to make sure that this is going to happen. And so the biggest issue for me is in dealing with the state of California is the inconsistency, and in addition to the then just not having, in my personal opinion, the courage to tell the activists, no, you're wrong. We understand that you're afraid of radiation. You should be afraid when there's a lot of it, but at low levels, there's absolutely no issue. And in fact, for the one site, I showed the risk to the public and the environment was greater during the shipment of the waste to the low-level waste site in Clive, Utah, than letting it just stay like that. And that can even move them 1 micron.
Just one comment. So I work nuclear power in Illinois, and right, there's an inconsistency in states. Well, I'm loud enough, I think.
Online folks.
Yeah.
And we're decommissioning Zion to 25 milligram a year, following the normal rules. Nothing special, nothing weird. I think we have a good, maybe it's the relationship we have with our communities, jobs, and all we did for years. But I listened to what he's having to go through, and that's unbelievable. Yet you have another state like Illinois that is just following NRC guidance to the page, right? And not an issue. So I can see that can be different.
But I must admit, I mean, the title of it was Nuclear Decommissioning in California. It should really have been nuclear decommissioning at Santa Susana. So I'm not sure. I'm sure that a lot of other sites in California haven't experienced what we are experiencing or have experienced. So Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for your attendance.